Hello and welcome to part 4 of the 2025 Weed Out Coordinator Training. My name is Hallie Minzer, and I'm the Restoration Ecologist for the Milwaukee County Parks Natural Areas Program. This fourth module in this Weed Out Coordinator Training will discuss the removal to restoration process. So this is going to cover planting. You have been doing invasive species removal likely for a number of years in your natural areas as a weed out coordinator and as part of your friends group. So now you are at that stage where you are interested in planting native species to fill in those gaps. All right, so let's talk about what that looks like. Once an invasive population has been controlled, you can plant native species into those bare areas, and this can be used as a way to help prevent reinvasion of that same area by new invasive species, which can happen when the soil is disturbed from removal activities, that sort of thing. You have to consider a few points in this planning process, and these are all points that I'm happy to discuss with you in person during a site visit just to go over all the logistics and see what works best for your site. So, kind of during the removal process and in between the time of that removal and thinking about starting to do plantings, we'll want to keep an eye on the site and really keep eyes on it for ideally 3 to 5 years as we're controlling these invasives. And this is because we want to see what's going on with the seed bank. As we're removing all these invasive species, whether it's garlic, mustard, or buckthorn, or another species of invasive, you can see that you are oftentimes disturbing the soil. You are, of course, introducing a lot more sunlight as you remove that plant material, and this can cause a flush of new plants to sprout up from the seed bank. Oftentimes, this can be another wave of invasive species, unfortunately, but sometimes it can be native species that begin to fill in as well. So, the reason that we try to have friends groups wait roughly 3 or 5 years from the very initial date of invasive species removal is because we want to see what's coming up from that seed bank. Because you might naturally have nice native species that are going to help fill in that area and can help lessen the necessary native planting that you would otherwise have to do. There is a caveat about this too, and I will say, and more research is coming out that it has proven beneficial in some instances that you want to go ahead and reseed that area with natives as soon as possible. You do want to be careful with this though. Some plants like garlic mustard and buckthorn have those chemicals that they emit into the soil that helps them outcompete other plants, so basically harms a lot of different species of native plants growing nearby. It would be a real shame if you planted natives and then you saw that, hey, they were struggling because these chemicals are persisting in the soil, for instance. So just something to think about there so that we're not wasting your time or your energy or money with these endeavors. But some research has, been coming out more and more that shows that introducing some native seeds to the area soon after removal into that kind of disturbed bare soil can help to lessen invasive species retaking over that area. And once again, you want to think about with that, hey, maybe if I'm just introducing a little bit of seed, that doesn't take a lot of my time or money to spread some native seed and see what comes up. Versus if you're planting plugs into that area right away, this is not something that we would recommend in almost any instance, because now you are going to have to be careful in your future invasive removal that you're not harming your native plants, that you're not trampling them, that they're not experiencing those negative effects from the invasive species still there. So potentially seeding soon after restoration begins could be an option for parks, but we wouldn't recommend planting plugs or trees into those right away in most instances. So thinking about design, we'll work with you on this, of course, but really trying to visualize what you want for the site. Coming up with this plan before purchasing is going to be necessary. If you're planting in a natural area, which is what we see most of our friends who in the Weed Out program are looking at. And I say this because this is different from planting in turf areas where you are going to want to work with forestry on that, but more on that to come. So planting in these natural areas, we'll want to discuss this beforehand because the plant list will need to be approved by me, as well as the planting location and certain activities will need to happen before this all moves forward. So thinking about what I want to plant, are these species going to be correct for the habitat, the right soil moisture, sunlight requirements, those sorts of things. Providing a map of the location to me is going to be really helpful, or we can go out and we could do that old-fashioned site visit and talk about the area too, and I can take down the, parameters of that expected planting area myself. That's just fine. Thinking about tools and funding. How much funding for these plants? If you're planting pollinator plugs or trees, that can add up pretty quickly with that funding. When you're thinking about the budget for that, for the herbaceous plants, for those plugs, for those pollinator plants, however you think of them, you can look at that by square footage. The general industry recommendation is that you plant for these wildflowers and grasses, every square foot you'll get one plant. So you can see that'll add up pretty quickly in price for even just a small area. If you're planting trees or shrubs in natural areas, our staff generally recommends 3-gallon pots, perhaps up to 5-gallon pots for those individual plants. And the reason that we recommend that is we often see those plants being a lot happier if they're in those smaller pots. They don't suffer transplant shock. There's less maintenance involved for them for watering and general upkeep. So that's our staff. When we do our giant tree plantings, we have majority 3-gallon pots. And it's just because the tree is a little bit less stressed out. When you plant it into the soil, there's less maintenance. We do it in fall, so naturally the trees are starting to go dormant at that time of year coming up soon, and we'll normally get enough rains so that we don't have to supplementally water them. So all things to consider there. If planting, so you might have to consider a watering plan too, especially depending on time of year or location or what species you're having. A lot of these plants are likely going to be a lot happier if you're able to give them some supplemental watering for a month or several or a couple months after they're planted, especially if this is a spring or summer planting. As I already said, the plants need to be approved by natural areas staff before they're purchased. So you can send a list that you're interested in planting my way, or if you'd like to start from scratch, I'd be happy to give you recommendations there. There is a change within this last year. Sometimes these projects need to go through a particular process in parks. That used to be the PIP process or the Parks Improvement process. It has now been rebranded as the Community Project Request. So if your specific planting plan needs to go through that, I'll work with you. It gets there's some details that I'm happy to work through with you on that process to get you started. I included this slide for the first time a year or two ago in 2024, give or take, and just to really emphasize the difference between what it looks like to plant in natural areas and what it looks like to plant in turf grass, because those are going to involve permissions and working with different park staff. So I'm over here in natural areas. All of this process is going to be when you're planting into those natural areas that you've worked on, for instance, removing buckthorn in there. So nothing that's in grass or a mowed area. So looks a lot like the information from the past slide. You'll work with me, we'll figure out all the details together, and we have the specific recommendations for that 3-gallon pot is something to be noted there for trees and shrubs. We wouldn't ever recommend really anything bigger than 5-gallon for the most part, with only certain exceptions. Do you need that watering plan like we talked about? And then really considering who's going to be doing this planting. Is it going to be members of the Friends group? Are you going to have volunteers come in there? And it's not just the core Friends group members. Maybe you have an agreement with the nursery that you bought the plants from, and they potentially will be planting them for you. So just going through all of these details. And then friends groups, you will need to contact Diggers Hotline 10 days prior to the planting date is the standard there. So there is the Diggers Hotline number where you can do that. And then just informing me with as much notice as possible to this planting date. Of course, you will inform me as we went through this process and approved the species list and figured that out together. But I'll also have to send out some requests for internal utility surveys to be done by our trades folks over here at Parks, because that's separate than Diggers. So enough notice that I can send in this ticket and they can get it done in a reasonable amount of time. So that's what it looks like for planting in those natural areas. Some friends groups do go ahead and fundraise to do those plantings in turf. And that's going to be more supervised by forestry staff. Also will include some input from planning, the parks planning department, as well as unit staff. So if you are interested in doing something like this and you don't know who to reach out to, please, you can reach out to me and I will forward your information to the necessary person and get you in contact with them. These turf conversion requests must be sent through, it says here the parks improvement process, but that is now that CPR process that is going to require a small fee, I think a $50 fee, something like that, to get that process up and running. But then once again, thinking about who's planting the trees, potentially is it folks from our forestry department? Will it be a contractor? Because these are going to be larger trees. So the forestry department requires a size of a 25-gallon ball and burlap for trees. You can see that's quite a difference from what we do in natural areas. They're doing it for aesthetic reasons. It just makes more sense in the turf areas to have these larger trees that are visible, that, you know, a new individual who is mowing for unit staff isn't going to accidentally mow it down thinking it's nothing. So they have their reasons behind doing the larger trees there. So being aware of that, of course, those prices are going to go up quite a bit more for those larger trees. What is going to be important too, and this will go through that improvement process, that CPR process, but if it is a contractor who's going to do the planting, it's going to be necessary that they have an ROE permit, what's known as a right of entry permit. So we'll have to make sure that's all in order before this project moves forward. And then either the contractor or Parks Forestry, instead of the individual from the Friends group, will call Diggers Hotline for this and conduct those internal utility surveys too. So ultimately, for all of this, just working through this for the appropriate process, knowing who to contact and how the whole process goes about, and as much advance notice as possible will absolutely be appreciated. All right, so implementation of these plantings. Providing those dates to natural area staff ahead of time is also really helpful because in some parks there that are very high use, you potentially have conflicting dates where a parking lot could be full or the land is being used by other park users for different activities. So making sure that the day of planting is going to work out well for you. Otherwise, those hotlines that I talked about are mandatory to have this done. So for natural areas plantings, friends groups will contact Diggers Hotline and work through that process. And then I will provide that planting area to our trade staff so that they can go on site and conduct those internal utility surveys. Finally, I would love to see pictures of the event. Your success stories, documentation is always wonderful to see. If you want to share that with your volunteers or share it to your social media page online, however you'd like to do that, that is always a crowd pleaser. Finally, the last slide for this presentation is our tracking and research. If you are interested in participating in one or multiple of our community science programs, we have opportunities that are available throughout most of the year. This can be really nice when you've been working in your area to restore these lands by removing these invasive species and by planting these nice natives and restoring the land. So it can be kind of a nice full circle to see how these different wildlife are using your parks or just adding another component of this work to your toolbox. The native seed collection program we've got going on as well, where if you are interested in collecting native seed from your park and having it planted elsewhere, or vice versa, is something that we could do together. So feel free to pause this slide and take a look at those opportunities and reach out if you're interested. With that, here is my contact information, my individual county email, but then also our collective, that Parks ComSci email at the bottom reaches Rebecca, our other restoration ecologist, Emily, our conservation biologist, and then me. All three of us maintain that inbox. So sometimes you'll see emails coming from me for Weed Out that are from there, but you can reach out to either of those emails with any questions that you have. Thank you for tuning in for these presentations. Have a wonderful day.